I'd like to start with just that phrase again from verse 14 of the 139th Psalm. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. So last weekend, although it seems like forever ago, Allison and I dropped our middle son, Eamon, off at college for the first time. Many of you know Eamon. And Connor, his big brother, was dropped off for his senior year the Thursday before. And I probably don't have to describe that moment to you, most of you anyway, because many of you are familiar with how that particular scene plays out. Many of you have been a parent in that situation. Many of you have been a student in that situation. Some of you have played all the roles. Some of you have been siblings as well. So you are aware of the fact that dropping someone off at school, or being dropped off at school, is a weird moment in one's life. It's not an awkward moment exactly, but it is, shall we say, multifaceted. We are pulled in that moment into the present, absorbing it with the wholeness of our hearts. And our hearts, I think you know, can be a little bit messy. In that moment, all the other concerns in our lives, like where we will eat on the way back, or what we will do at work on Monday, are frozen in time, set aside for when this moment ends. As we stand there in the parking lot of the dormitory saying our goodbyes, we all feel all the feels at the same time. There is joy. For some of us, there is relief. And there is excitement, as well as fear and trepidation about the new thing that is about to commence. But we also feel sadness, mourning for another thing, a precious, holy thing, a phase in our lives and in our relationships that is ending. And then that moment ends too. We are no longer called to be fully present, and we turn away to walk into that dorm, to climb into our cars for the long drive home. I should say, I went to college 30 minutes from my house, where I grew up. My mom said the drive was still pretty long. But we know as we depart in that moment, we know what it means to be fearfully and wonderfully made. We know what it means to be fearful and wonderful. The psalmist celebrates this fact, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, the psalm says. But the psalm doesn't say something else. The psalm doesn't say that we are perfectly made. That's a different thing. And that is why when we turn away from that moment in transition, whatever it is, and step into our new lives, we often feel another emotion that we're a little surprised by, or at least I feel this emotion as a good New Englander, namely embarrassment. Embarrassment at not being able to make sense of the profound change in my life, the profound change in your lives. In that moment, we can feel flawed and exposed in the face of the experience of saying goodbye and hello. We are human beings after all. And we come into this world with obvious imperfections and failings, and yet we're still a little ashamed of them. Imperfections and failings that we have measured to in our own standards and certainly the standards of the world. As individuals, we fail. As a group, we fail. Anyone who has paid attention to current events over the summer knows that humans fail. And anyone who has reflected on their own lives can see the dark times that they have passed through. And when we are out of step with our spiritual path, in those times, in the dark times, where we cannot make sense of anything, we can feel that there is no turning around. There is no hope for us, that judgment has been passed once and for all, that we have been found wanting. And we are embarrassed. And we just want to walk further and further away from our discomfort and our confusion. So thank God. Thank God that the journey of faith does not require perfection and does not require objectivity. And in fact, the journey of faith is comfortable, whether we are comfortable or not, with tears, awkwardness, and anger, because instead we are called to step into the fear and the wonder that created us. But contrary to that call, there are those other journeys, other paths we find ourselves on that really, really want us to seek that perfection. Am I right? I won't ask for hands. There are those other journeys and those other paths that try to get us back into our lane, not for our needs, but for theirs. And thanks to the cultural waters that we swim in, sometimes we deceive ourselves at times into believing that that path of perfection is the valid path, or at least an equally valid one. But there are problems when we choose to go that way, not the least of which is that the end goal, perfection, is not achievable. The quest for perfection requires us to be tough, to set ourselves apart. It requires us to spend our time on self-improvement, seeking always to be better rather than to just be. Rather than to just be our authentic selves, and to let others be their authentic selves. The path of perfection makes us worry about our perceived weaknesses, about being broken by the passage of life. When we stand in that college parking lot, or when we stand before the altar at a wedding or a funeral, or beside the bed of an ailing friend or of a new child, when we lie in the sick bed ourselves, the path of perfection urges us to avoid our feelings that are part of our fearful and wonderful creation. It urges us to rationalize them. It makes us turn away from the fear and the wonder of life and towards words. Towards words. Tools that we use to make systems and abstractions, to build objective beliefs that we can use to climb out of the subjective moments where we live, so that we can be, or at least appear to be, reasonable when we're not feeling reasonable. But here's the thing. I know it will come as a shock to some of you. Reason has its limits. Reason has its limits. After all, hope is not objective, and love is definitely not rational. The intellectual ladders that we climb take us away from experiencing our humanity, from experiencing creation and the transcendent, away from when and where we are most human, which is when and where we are most broken. Whether for good or for ill, we have been blessed with the miracle of a life that is entwined with both love and loss. And from that very blessing in the midst of our imperfections, we are able to see the blessing of life and love in others in the midst of their imperfections. See, society, too often the church, want us to step away from the experience of that love. They tell us that fear and wonder are merely the purview of people like poets or prophets or artists, and that we sober, practical people, we must be strong and rational beings, holding on to our education and experience to create these forms and structures that will keep our fancies in line. But again, the psalmist says, and the Bible says elsewhere too, that we are all wonderfully and fearfully made. We are all wonderfully and fearfully made. Our lives are not actually governed by labels, but by being a part of things, by being present in the hard moments, by having our hearts broken and mended again and again and again. Now, sometimes I'm asked, occasionally by church members, but most often by ministers, how many people at the Eliot Church are Unitarian or Trinitarian? This really fascinates my colleagues. How many are Unitarian or Trinitarian, Universalist or atheist or agnostic? What labels they want to know. What labels do members and staff carry in an ancient battle of ideas? As if we were all intellectually consistent all the time. As if such a thing can or should be put on a list at annual meeting. Now, they're my friends, so I do my best to answer them, of course. But hopefully, it doesn't come as a surprise to you that I don't particularly care about systematics and what system you are using. Because that's not how we live. What matters on the path of faith is finding ways to experience the divine in our lives. What matters is in those moments of openness, when we can be in the fear and in the wonder. We see the light of connection. We see the Spirit, the holiness in and around us, and we continue on a journey of becoming. And that, I feel, is the role of the church. Not to strive for or require perfection, not to build systems, intellectual or otherwise, that allow us to label ourselves and each other, and that determine who is what, and to measure our belonging. Instead, the role of the church and of the congregation, the role of people, is to experience the sacred and the holy in our lives and in each other's lives. To experience it in times of happiness and sorrow, to see and know that even though the experience of the world breaks us down, and it does break us down sometimes, even though the experience of the world breaks us down, we can grow closer to God. We can grow closer to creation. We can form a deeper life through the power of the love that brings healing and hope. Angela Herrera, in our first reading today, gives us a piece of advice to start the new church year with. Do not leave your broken heart at the door. Instead, bring it, she says, to the altar of life. Do not leave your broken heart at the door, but bring it to the altar of life. This is a new year for us, here at the church and elsewhere in our lives. It is a time to be present to the fear and the wonder wherever we may find it. And here at Eliot Church, We must strive to bring our broken hearts into this room for this hour, and into the midst of these people at all hours, to allow us to be pulled into the present, to feel all the feels, and in our vulnerability to recognize that we are all fearfully and wonderfully made in the midst of a fearful and wonderful world. Amen.